We've got a few questions here, and in true Dimbleby fashion, I'd like to name the questioner. The first one, great to have him in the audience, John Moulton. Your question, please, sir.
Does the panel worry about the morality of running such a big public deficit? How much should we spare ourselves now at the expense of others later?
Let's start with Margot.
Well, Fraser, what company would have ever got to the point we are in? And obviously, I think that changes to the Chief Executive and Finance Director would have been made long ago. But we live in a democracy, and of course that government ran its course and did immense damage over the last 6 months. It now transpires that there are numerous pledges that the last government gave to all sorts of interest groups, and indeed to a hospice in my own constituency, which are completely unfunded. And so there is a terrible problem. The morality, I think clearly we have an issue where we are living on debt that a generation to come is going to have to pay off. And the morality is that we have to, I think, make serious cuts to the way that we all live and spend public money, so that the next generation is at least has a better chance to enjoy some of the benefits that our generation have enjoyed.
I mean, Nadim, you're a co-founder of YouGov. I imagine, well, you know what it's like. I mean, there are occasions, are there not, where debt has a role to play?
Absolutely does, absolutely right. But I think the sense I get from the last sort of 4 and a bit weeks that I've been there is the line's begun to blur for Labour between the emergency economic stimulus that was right and proper to try and stop us going into a depression versus getting to a stage where you sort of become like an alcoholic and or a shopaholic, and you stop thinking about anything because that sort of excuse of, oh well, it's an economic stimulus, let's just keep spending, and you get to a point where, oh well, just another few billion doesn't really matter because it'll come right in the never. That's the feeling you get, certainly in the last 6 months. I'm sure they didn't start out that way, but it's as if it's sort of drifted into a place of irresponsibility. And I think you're absolutely right when you say, is there a moral imperative that we have to do this because we owe it to the generations to come? You're absolutely right. There is a bigger question here, which is how do we govern ourselves? I think one of the great things that's coming out of the coalition is this idea is that we're going to have this open debate, a transparent debate, and we're almost forced into it because of being in coalition. We can't have it in back rooms and then come out whipped and agree. We're going to have it in public. I think that's a good thing because we're going to have a debate about how do we want to be governed. We've got all this sort of stuff going to local government, to getting hospitals to become more foundation hospitals. There is a price to pay with that, i.e. some will run themselves very well, others will be a disaster, and the media headlines in the news of the world will be the disasters. Will politicians then shirk from it and go back to central command and control, bigger departments in Whitehall? I don't know.
Charlie, you've written plenty for the CPS warning about the fiscal position. But, I mean, John's point was about the morality. How do you manage to get that across?
I think to view this through the prism of morality is just the wrong way to look at it altogether. You need to look at the size of the deficit. It's now 160 to 170 billion this year. On my rough calculations, that's £6,500 per household in this country of more debt for each and every household. Completely unaffordable. And the question is, how do you close that deficit? You need to get the country to grow faster. That's one thing you should be doing, and that is a moral good, because there are more jobs, more money, more prosperity for our nation and our countrymen, to my mind, is a moral good and an imperative of any government. But you also need to just close the gap and be more efficient in terms of the public spending. We cannot carry on spending as we have done. But you can reform things, you can do other things. You can, for example, sell off excess assets or restructure excess assets that the state has. And I think that needs to be looked at very carefully. There's some quite radical reforms that I've been discussing with colleagues that we could look at in terms of the nature of how local government is structured, the nature of how housing stock is structured in this country, which could be purely and massively transformative in what we do and raise billions and billions for the exchequer. So my prime interest is how do you raise money? Because if you raise money, you don't need to do such immediate and savage cuts. And you can get the country through the downturn more easily and less painfully and rebalance the economy at the same time. So we have a larger private sector and a smaller public sector. So I think to look at it in terms of morality is the wrong way to look at it. The right way to look at it is how do we rebuild the prosperity and success of our nation and pay down the debt at the same time.
Right. John, you used to be head of the Conservative Research Department.
Briefly.
But in that job, you'll have to think to yourself, how do we sell the language of what we're trying to do here? The word morality and cuts have not been put together by the Conservative Party. Why is that?
Well, I think it goes to the heart of the problem with the Conservative Party in terms of why we didn't win the election outright, which is that we sort of lacked courage to take an argument based on some absolute moral principles. And I mean, I believe that it's immoral to compel people through high taxes, indirect and direct taxes, to take that money off them and then spend it wastefully. Spend it on functions of government that encourage dependency, that encourage individuals to think that there's always a safety net there no matter what they do. That is a moral argument. I mean, and I just think that, collectively we sort of lack the nerve, because after 13 years of living in that environment, Middle England and those people who hadn't voted for us in sufficient numbers over the last 2 elections weren't going to come back, or that was the fear, they wouldn't come back if they heard that harsh message. And the reality is now we've got no other option. We've got to look at this plainly and clearly, and we've got to advance a whole array of arguments. But until we can trim back the size of the state, avoid spending so much money on debt payments, and without encouraging growth and a rebalancing of the economy towards the private sector, we won't achieve a sustainable future. So I do think there is a moral argument. I think we need to have the courage to go with it, because I think it does run with the grain of the instincts of most people. And I think we just failed to really go far enough during the election campaign.
Laura, it's, I guess the end of John's question was how much should we spare ourselves at others' expense? Is that an argument which you think would have traction?
I mean, I agree very much with John and the other panellists. I mean, I think that there is actually a different moral question to ask as well, and that is, what did we get for the money that has been spent over the last 13 years? I mean, what tangible, was it investment or was it expenditure? And my problem is I find it very difficult to point to exactly what we have achieved in long-term infrastructure, change in our education, significant output and change in our health service. And that has been, for me, the immorality of the last 13 years. It has just been cash spending. And I'd like to pick up something that John said, and that is about the dependency culture. We've actually created a country that does feel in some ways the right to be dependent. And I had an interesting example of this, a couple who, in my area, our average wage is £17,000. They're earning £48,000. And they came up to me and said, Laura, I do hope that we're not going to, you're not going to get rid of family tax credits for people on my sort of income. So as a candidate, you can always sort of say, well, way above my pay grade. Which probably is a little bit more difficult now. But anyway, I'll still try it. And they said, it would be absolutely dreadful if you did that. It pays for our second holiday. Now, I believe that actually the last 13 years has, in many ways, brainwashed us. And it's not just policies. It is not just fiscal measures. It is actually a psychological damage that has been done to the country. And so my feeling is that we've got a moral duty to change the language, to change the approach and change the attitude of this country if we're not going to find ourselves just slipping back further and further.